It was the shot heard around the world. The Supreme Court of the United States of America is going to overturn Roe v. Wade. Sit right there for another episode of Timeless Dialogues, where we discuss this issue and more, specifically as it pertains to what are seen now as the top arguments for abortion by the people who claim to be caring for women the most. Now, for all of you who are aware, there has been a shot heard around the world. Politico broke the story this week that, according to them, somebody leaked a document saying that the Supreme Court of the United States of America is going to overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, this doesn't mean that abortion is going to completely go away. It doesn't mean that the battle is over and the war is done. Rather, what it's going to do is it's going to return the issue back to the states. And this has infuriated the left. And if you look on social media, you see senators and you see other politicians, you see sort of Hollywood figures, you see people that you went to college with, friends that you went to high school with, the people that live right down the street from you, discussing these topics. So what I want to do today is I want to respond to some of the main arguments that are being put forth related to these issues. But before we do, I want to go into a special little episode of Realville. Now, as many of you know, we've added this little segment as a way of discussing many of the pertinent issues of our day. And we're going to try to apply logic and reasoning to them because, as we have said before, our first mayor, El Rushbo, talks about these things. He says, I live in Realville, and my problem is that I'm governed by logic. And some of the claims that are made by people on the left just don't hold up. Now, we discuss this all the time. If you're governed by logic and rational thought, when you look at many of the claims that are being made by people on the left, they seem to be absurd. What they're claiming doesn't necessarily follow. And when it comes to this issue, we have seen for literally decades now, people making claims about the so-called pro-choice position, which is really pro being able to murder my child position. Yes, if we're right, and the preborn child is actually a human being, that's exactly what it is. In the womb, it's a innocent human life. And when you look at the arguments that they've been making, none of them hold up. But look at the rhetoric that's been coming about. In fact, if we're going to look at this and we're going to look at sort of this key issue, I can't hold myself back. In fact, we got to have a little help from the mayor himself with our first little video here.
Trumpet fanfare update time. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen.
Who might it be? Elizabeth Warren. Now listen to what she's saying here. Look at how she changes the topic. She gets her moral outrage of the situation. And we see the rhetoric that they're bringing to this, how angry they are, how they can't believe that somebody would go in and overturn something, even though the will of the people might be somewhere different, and the will of the people might want to take them in a different direction. But if you think about it, isn't this exactly what the left has been doing for years? Quote unquote, not listening to the will of the people, when the fact is that we live in the most pro-life generation that can be found. There are more people that show up for pro-life causes than there ever has been before. But have you noticed how they keep changing the subject? How they keep changing this topic and they speak with moral outrage? There's very few things that this reminds me of, but I could think of one, very, very much one type of inquisition where they keep changing the whole guidelines and the borders and the parameters to it. Let's sit right here real quick and look at another one.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Oh, the
Our
outrage.
chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear.
Oh, the
Our two weapons
change.
are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency. Our three weapons
Oh,
are
the
fear
two.
and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope. Our four
Oh, the logic of the left.
amongst our weapons.
And so much more. Again, this is what we find here. When we come back to this whole idea, I live in Realville, and the problem is that I'm governed by logic. And the left, much like the Spanish Inquisition, they keep changing the goalposts. What's the real issue here? I thought you liked it when the will of the people was actually heard. And in the case of Elizabeth Warren, it's really not so much that she's, morally just erupting over this is the fact that her ideology is being crushed. On one hand, she says that she's all for the will of the people, but when the will of the people elect a president who then appoints 3 pro-life justices that really come back to the point where they're interpreting the Constitution according to the intent of the framers, of which there is no provisions for the pro-choice position, we're left with this so-called moral outrage of the left. Again, governed by logic, not leftism. So what I want to do today is I want to transition and I want to look at this whole issue of what are we going to do with the arguments made by so-called pro-choice individuals. And there has been something going around on Facebook, Twitter, all over the internet, and it's nothing new. It's something that's been around for quite some time now, and it's called "I'm not pro-murdering babies, ... And we see all of the things that they're trying to say is that I'm not for murdering babies, but I'm for abortion in these very select cases, which they think get around being murder, doesn't sound as heinous as it might come across. But yet it's the full-fledged pro-choice position. And this person here, the good intentions, I'm sure they have good intentions as they are stepping into an abortion mill, or not. But what we have to see here is that it says this: I'm pro-Becky, who found out at her 20-week anatomy scan that the infant she had been so excited to bring into the world, or this world, had developed without life-sustaining organs. And we're supposed to say, see, this is a case in which we need to be pro-choice. Because what is Becky supposed to do in her difficult situation? And they use these types of arguments as a means and a way to sway this discussion on Roe v. Wade. So what I want to do is I actually want to evaluate this whole article, this whole claim that's come about. And I'm titling this, "I'm not pro-murdering babies, a pro-life response to 12 women facing abortion." And you see the quote here about being pro-Becky. Now, when you look through this, there really aren't 12 different arguments. I kind of counted roughly 9 different arguments. Some of them are the old arguments, some of them are nuances to them. And it's things like the viability of the child, the rape of the woman, the physical health of the mother, seduction of a minor, and that would be something where you have a child who's being seduced by an older person and they get pregnant, or the inability to provide materially, physically, or emotionally, safety of other children in the womb. So somebody has a procedure and they have multiple children and they got to get rid of some, or it's going to harm either the mother or the other children, or the woman did not intend to get pregnant. This is the old consent to sex / pregnancy argument. What about physically abusive relationship? A woman's in a physically abusive relationship. What is she supposed to do? And then finally, the age of the woman. So let's go through and we're going to evaluate these one by one. We're not going to spend too much time because I want to make this a go-to reference for people to see the arguments from the left, to lay out their claims, and to respond to their claims as we try to add to this conversation. So the first one we're going to call Becky, and we've already seen Becky. I'm pro-Becky, who found out at 20 weeks, week anatomy scan, that the infant she had been so excited to bring into this world had developed without life-sustaining organs. So what's her claim? The issue is this: the baby lacks viability to exist outside of the womb due to deformed or lacking organs, or any other type of deformity or lack of viable living conditions. And we've seen this whole viability argument for years. It's something of, well, how could we bring a baby into this world if it lacks the viability to actually survive in this world? So let's respond to this. First of all, the viability of the child. Pro-abortionists fail to recognize that there's a difference between substance and accidents. There's no substantial difference between a preborn in the womb and a born child outside of the womb. Have you ever noticed this? All of the genetic material is there. All of the DNA is there. It's as much of a human inside of the womb as it is outside of the womb. Nothing has changed, either scientifically, medically, or metaphysically. Another thing that we have to see here is that the viability of the preborn changes with the increase of medical technology. We now have a greater ability to help children survive in such situations. So in many respects, when they're looking at this type of argument, they're acting as though medical progress has not increased in our ability to actually sustain a child. So as we've already talked about, there's no substantial difference between a child in the womb and a child outside of the womb. There's no DNA difference. There's no difference when it comes to actually, is it a human being inside the womb or outside of the womb? But one thing that has changed since Roe v. Wade is the fact that medical technology has increased to the point where there are very few cases where a child is actually unable to survive outside of the womb. That's why it brings us to this point that medical technology never determines the substantial nature of the preborn. The so-called viability of an individual is not determined by medical advances. However, medical advances can sustain what we know to be as a human being. The point is this: Dr. Seuss was correct. A person's a person no matter how small, and a person's a person no matter how many issues they face medically. Now, if we continue to look at this, we can play this out even further. By this line of reasoning, there are many people outside of the womb we could potentially get rid of because they cannot survive on their own. They're no longer viable in their environment, and this environment is outside of the womb. So by the logic of this whole called viability of the child, we can just make it a viability of the human being. And like we were saying, there are individuals outside of the womb who we would have to, in many respects, get rid of because they're no longer able to sustain themselves. So, for example, would an individual living in an extremely cold climate still be a person if he or she were unable to live in that particular environment without life-sustaining care, heat, shelter, food, etc.? Are we willing and ready and actually going to do away with people that live in extreme cold situations? They're not viable. They have to have some kind of life-sustaining modern advances in order for them to survive. Or what about an individual that's in an overly hot place where maybe they need air conditioning? Maybe we have to have modern scientific advances to bring them water or food or somehow to sustain food. Or what if we took a person and put them on a space shuttle and sent them to outer space? There's no oxygen, there's no food, there's no ability for them to viably sustain themselves out there. But yet we realize that they're all still human beings. So the problem with this argument is that it actually claims too much. If it's actually used consistently, we would have to get rid of any individual who's not viably able to survive on their own. And that's why we talk about this. Would an individual living in a place with a low level of oxygen still be a person if he or she were unable to live in that particular environment without oxygen? Like a scuba diver who needs oxygen to survive deep under the water? Are we going to now go so far as to say people that are in outer space or under the ocean who need modern advances in technology to keep them alive are no longer sustainable human beings? Heaven forbid. But the point is this: if the counterexamples disprove the reasoning of the later 2, 3, 4, or 5 that we've already discussed, it would also disprove the reasoning of the preborn, who also have all the same qualities of being a human person or human beings, even though they need sustaining help due to some kind of medical condition outside of the womb. The point is, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If you're willing, by that line of reasoning, to abort somebody inside of the womb, why won't you get rid of scuba divers and NASA space astronauts or any other individual that's living in a cold climate or an overly hot climate? The fact is that we don't, because we realize that the issue is that they are still human beings regardless of their size or living conditions or the viability in which they find themselves. The second one is Susan. Now, Susan is this: I'm pro Susan, who was sexually assaulted on her way home from work, only to come to the horrific realization that her assailant planted his seed in her when she got a positive pregnancy test result a month later. So what's the issue that we look at here? The woman was raped, therefore we can abort the child. But when we look at this argument, we find that there are a few things. So it would say this: because she was raped, so Susan won't have to deal with mental anguish of the child. She should abort this child for that reason. In addition, because Susan was raped, Susan also did not intend to have a child, so she should be able to actually abort the child. So when we look at these different types of arguments, we find a few things: the whole rape of the woman, and we're actually going to look at the whole issue of intention of pregnancy later. Now, the first thing we find is this: we have to unequivocally say that rape is understandably an emotionally traumatic situation. Anybody that goes through a rape has been through a horrible situation, and no one is downplaying the horrendous reality of rape. We all recognize that it is not something that we want anybody to endure, and it's not something that we're actually going to endorse in any respect or in any situation. It's a total violation of that individual's human rights. But when we look at this argument, In this situation, one is actually offering an argument against raping a woman, not about the humanity or personhood of the child. When a person brings forth this argument, notice this, they're not actually giving you an argument against the personhood or the inherent value of that child. Rather, they're giving you a good argument against rape. Namely, it creates emotionally traumatic situations that can affect the entire life of an individual. But as we continue to look at this, if the unborn is a human and or person, then intentionally taking its innocent life, regardless of the circumstance, is murder. The real issue, like most situations related to abortion, is the human status of the preborn, not specifically the situation that's taking place. Again, notice this. In order to make an argument for abortion, you somehow have to make an argument that the preborn baby in the womb is not an actual person. But this doesn't do it. It's nowhere in the premises, therefore it's nowhere in the conclusion. In addition, one thing is this, is that we actually offer sympathy to the rape victim because a great injustice was done to the innocent woman. So because the woman is innocent and because she has inherent value to her and it's something that we want to protect, we offer sympathy. We bring the full measure of the law down upon the actual rapist because she has the right to be defended as a human being under the laws of this land, and because the rights that she has are recognized by the laws of this land. They're given to her by her creator. However, it would be a great inconsistency to permit a second injustice to another innocent person because an injustice was experienced by the first person. In short, two wrongs never make a right. If it is wrong to commit an unjust act against an individual in one arena, namely in this case, raping a woman, then it would be wrong to commit an unjust act against an individual in another arena. In this case, the abortion of a preborn child. My point is this, is that if you're going to argue that it's wrong to commit unjust acts to individuals in one place because of the inherent value that they have to them and because of the inherent rights given to them both by God and by the law, then why would we remove them from somebody else? Again, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If we are going to somehow allow the committing of a second wrong done to this individual, then what basis do we have to say that the first one can't just be overlooked? But we're not going to overlook the first one. We're going to say because they hold this status as a human being, by logical consistency, we're going to protect them. And by the same line of reasoning, because the preborn child has human viability, human personhood, human nature, they have value, rights, and the justice of the land is to be given to that individual. Like we said, in short, two wrongs never make a right. But as we continue to look at this, notice this. Abortion does not take away the evil of rape. It adds another evil to it. The real problem of rape is not remedied by abortion. And when you add abortion to the problem of rape, you're not remedying anything. You're actually adding more fuel to the fire. You're actually adding more evil to the situation. Now you don't just have rape, you have both rape and murder. But as we look at this, the person who committed the rape is the one who should be punished, the truly guilty one, not the innocent baby. Give justice to whom justice is due. An innocent baby that's the consequence of an unjust situation doesn't deserve to be brutally murdered in the womb. The person who committed the rape is the one who should be punished, not the innocent baby. Now, here's the interesting thing. Ironically, Norma McCorvey, whose name was Jane Roe in the famous Roe v. Wade case, claimed she was raped and used that as justification to overthrow federal anti-abortion laws. Later on, however, McCorvey admitted she lied, thus undermining the original claim, substantiating the case. The point is this, is that there are sometimes cases where people will cry rape when they actually weren't raped. They just want to get rid of the child. But again, abortion does not take away the evil of rape. It adds more evil to it. So we should never fight evil with evil. What we find is that goodness trumps evil. Love conquers a multitude of sins, and we should justly punish the rapist, not the innocent child in the womb. Let's continue on here. Teresa and Courtney. Now, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to put these together because in many respects, even though it's two different situations, they're making the similar argument or a similar argument. So it goes on to say, I'm pro Teresa, who hemorrhaged due to a placental abduction, causing her parents, spouse, and children to have to make the impossible decision on whether to save her or her unborn child. So the issue is, we must choose to save either the mother or the child. The second one is this. I'm pro Courtney, who just found out she's already 13 weeks along, but the egg never made it out of her fallopian tube, so either she terminates the pregnancy or risks dying from internal bleeding. So what's the issue here? The life of the mother is at stake. So in both of these, we find that there's a case for the life of the mother or the child. You either have to abort the child, they say in this situation, or the mother is going to die. Now, when we look at this type of issue, we can call this the physical health of the mother. This could be sort of the claim, the issue that's taking place here. So for whatever it's worth, we have to find this. The argumentative weight of these claims lose much of their force because the advance of modern medicine has thankfully made many of these type of scenarios very, very infrequent. Think about this. Whenever you go and you see actually the rise of medical technology, we have found that there are very few situations in the world in which we live where we find this actual scenario. So what they make it out as is though this is happening all the time. It's a frequent occurrence. It's happening day in and day out, thousands upon thousands of people, when the reality is that the medical evidence just does not show it. Now, there may be people who are facing these types of situations, but it's not a life or death situation. But the second thing that we have to look at is this, is that we don't make decisions based off of rare exceptions, but the normal circumstances in regular cases. We never make laws based off of anomalies, but recurring situations. Now, what we have to find is that both lives are equal and deserve respect and care. So we do all that we can to save both. In all of these situations where it's usually an issue of life of the mother versus life of the child, we fight with every ounce of our being to preserve both of them. The baby's life is not less valuable because it is inside the womb, and the mother's more valuable because it is outside of the womb. Both of them are human beings. Both of them are persons. Both of them are of equal value. So from the very start, the normal case to these kinds of situations with our modern medical technology is to work with every fiber of our being to save both of them. We don't somehow just reduce the child to being a secondary status just because it's preborn and it's in the womb and somehow not as valuable as the woman who's outside of the womb. But this does leave us with a real situation. In most cases, we can deliver the baby without threatening either the mother or the baby. But the pro-life position is able to account for situations where the mother's life is truly at stake. There are scenarios where it would actually take the life of the mother. The goal is to do all that is possible to save the mother and baby's lives. However, this is not always the case. And the pro-life position has always affirmed this is a life for life issue, not an abortion on demand issue, which never preserves the life of the preborn. This is an issue where we know every single time you abort the child, a life is going to be lost. Here, we're recognizing the preservation of life, not the absolute destruction of life. There are cases where we fight for the life of both figures, whereas in abortion, we're actually fighting to dismantle the life of one individual every single time that it occurs. In addition to this, if one's life is truly threatened, then we have the right for self-defense. And because sort of ectopic pregnancies or any other situations they might want to place like this actually threaten the life of the mother, she has the right to self-defense. And in that sense, it's not truly an abortion. It's an issue of preservation of her own life. But again, they're rare. We always fight for the life of both. And it somehow doesn't mean that when the child is going through this, they're somehow subhuman. But what we find is this. In this case, either the baby dies or else both will die. It is always better to save one life than to lose two or both lives. Now, one thing that we have to find here is that there was an article actually responding to this. An individual named Will Wright responds, and I think that he's correct. And he says this: ectopic pregnancies can rupture between 5 and 11 weeks generally. So this discovery would require immediate action. If the fallopian tube burst, the internal bleeding would indeed be serious for the mother. An ectopic pregnancy will not proceed, as the fallopian tube can simply not support a baby. But then he goes on to say this: the course of treatment would likely be a partial tubal ligation. The outcome of this would be a 50% loss in overall fertility and will result in the death of the baby. However, this is not an abortion. Notice, the medical procedure has the primary intention of removing the fallopian tube to preempt the various serious rupture and internal bleeding. The secondary, foreseen, but unintended effect is the death of the baby. This is tragic, but it is not an abortion. Abortion is the direct and intentional killing of a baby in the womb. And this is not the direct intentional killing of a baby, but a secondary effect of saving the life of the mother. And if you're looking for this article, you can see it right here. You can look it up online, and you can actually see how he responds to each of the individuals, all of these 12 different women that are laid out in this whole argument. In fact, this is the only one that I referred to in the making of this video. Now, the next one that we have to look at is Kathy. And when we look at Kathy, it says this: I'm pro Kathy, who had her innocence ripped away from her by someone she should have been able to trust, and her 11-year-old body isn't mature enough to bear the consequences of that betrayal. So, what's the actual issue here? Well, it's hard to tell. Kathy was either, one, physically raped and lost her innocence, which resulted in pregnancy, or seduced by a supposed older male figure, which resulted in pregnancy. So in one sense, we find that there are younger children who are raped. It's not according to their will or their wishes, but we understand what seduction is. Obviously, it's a horrible wrong that's done to young children and even women of all ages, where they're in many ways tricked into having sexual encounters with people, which ultimately aren't for the good of that figure. They're rather to just fulfill the harmful lusts and pleasures of another figure, which is just a really, sort of nice way of saying an absolute jerk who used manipulative means to achieve his sexual goals. But when we look at this, let's look at this issue of a seduction of a woman or a seduction of a minor. What's actually going on here? And is it an actual good argument for abortion? However, notice this: abortion does not actually take away the evil of seduction. Like we've said before, it adds another evil to it. The real problem of seduction is not remedied by abortion. In fact, now you have seduction plus murder. The real way that you handle a seductive situation is by going after the person that seduced the young girl or any woman in that situation. We don't add more evil to an evil situation. Evil is triumphed by good, which is by bringing justice to the man that was seducing him, not by aborting the child. In addition to this, the person who seduced the woman, like we said, or the minor in this case, should be punished because they're the truly guilty one, not the innocent baby. Give blame to whom blame is due and declare innocent those who are actually innocent. Bring justice upon whom justice is due, but preserve the life of those who have done no wrong. And in this case, the person who did no wrong was the innocent baby. And it's also the person that was either raped or seduced. The person that did the wrong was the seducer, not the one that was seduced. The one who did the wrong was the seducer, not the baby. But as we continue to look at this, the age of the woman pregnant does not change the personhood of the preborn child in the womb. Have you noticed this? A preborn child in an 11-year-old or a 40-year-old woman is substantially still a human person. Have you ever thought about this? When you look at the issue of age is a real factor, and age brings real legal consequences to real situations. But one thing age does not do is determine the substantial nature of the child. A child or a person is still a person regardless of how big they are, and a child is still a child, and a person is still a person regardless of whether it's in an 11-year-old womb, a 40-year-old womb, or with the case of Abraham, his wife was way up in age. You see my point? The point is that the age of the woman pregnant does not change the person of the preborn child in the womb. It may change the circumstances of the mother, but it doesn't actually change the definition and the substantial nature of the person in the womb. It's actually not addressing the issue at all. It's giving you a conclusion that's not found in either of the premises. But as we continue to look at this, the 40-year-old woman, the 11-year-old girl, and the preborn child are all persons, because age does not determine human personhood. In this case, to claim only 2 out of the 3 are human persons is inconsistent, because there is a substantial similarity between each of them, and they only differ in age and location. In fact, the moral outrage that you have for why you should protect a 40-year-old woman that's raped or seduced, or an 11-year-old girl that's raped or seduced, is based off of the fact that they're human persons and that they deserve values and righteousness and justice, and that we should protect them under the law. That's because all persons have rights underneath the law. And just because one happens to be inside the womb and a little younger with a different location doesn't somehow change the essential nature of that preborn child. So again, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If a person that's 11 or 40 is going to be given inherent value under the laws of the land and the rights of their creator because they're made in the image of God and bear human personhood, then why would we not extend that exact same right to one that's inside the womb? We never triumph evil with evil. Rather, we triumph evil with goodness. And in this case, the goodness is preserving the human life and bringing justice against the person that seduced and or raped the young child. Now, 2 more that we're going to bring together. I'm going to call Melissa and Brittany. It says, I'm pro Melissa, who's working 2 jobs just to make ends meet and has to choose between bringing another child into poverty or feeding the child she already has because her spouse walked out on her. In short, the issue is Melissa cannot provide for another child, as evidenced by the fact she can barely provide for her current children, or in fact cannot provide altogether for her current children, as we've seen. But the second one is I'm pro Brittany, who realizes that she is in no way financially, emotionally, or physically able to raise a child. Issue, Brittany lacks all forms of resources to provide for her child. So the first one is that it's dealing more with like a financial housing situation. The other one is a financial housing situation, but for a variety of reasons, she's emotionally unable to. Maybe she was traumatized. Maybe she has some other situation. And we really relate to people like this. We are there to care for them in these types of situations. Or maybe she's physically unable to. Maybe she has some kind of disability. Maybe she has an injury of some sort. We don't know. All we know is that there's financial, emotional, and physical issues that keep her from so-called being able to raise a child. So we can label all of these as a variety of inability to provide types of claims. What we have to find is that when we think about this, we want to sympathize with these figures because they're in a real dire situation. Food and clothing and sustenance are not things to just overlook. But one of the reasons that we provide people with food and clothing and sustenance is because we realize that human beings are valuable and that there is something inherently valuable, and we have the moral obligation and right to provide for them. And for that reason, there are real means provided by the pro-life community to help provide for women in these types of situations. This type of argument would only work if there weren't actual provisions, but there are provisions. And there are people who will work with women, who will work with children. There are people that will provide financially for them. They'll provide materially for them. They provide childcare for them. If we can say anything, it's this. The pro-life community for decades has worked and worked diligently to provide in almost every sphere of influence for women in these exact types of situations. Now, when we look at this, we also find that adoption is also a viable and caring option for women in these types of situations. If you truly can't provide for your child and you feel like nobody's going to actually help you provide for that child physically, materially, or in any other way or means, adoption is a real choice. You're not giving up on your child. You're giving your child everything that you think it needs, namely a caring home where the child's going to be provided with the things that it needs to live a good and healthy life. But the central issue still hasn't changed. In this whole issue, no one in this none of these undermine these quality of life issues, undermine the essential personhood of the preborn. Just because a person may live a hard life does not entail they are no longer entitled to actual life. We realize that when we look at this situation, that it actually doesn't deal with the issue at hand. How does inability to provide change the actual essential nature of the preborn child? It all comes down to a definition of terms and what's contained in the premises. And when you look at the terms of human beings, we understand that there are rights that are brought to it. But in their premises for so-called aborting the child, there's nothing inherent within those premises that lead to the conclusion that they're trying to say. Rather, what we find here is that it's actually an argument for the fact that when you look at human beings, we realize that human beings should be taken care of, that they shouldn't be hurt, that they shouldn't be harmed. So if it's a human being outside of the womb and should be protected, why do we not extend the same argument and the provisions inside of the womb? In fact, if you're willing to provide for it outside of the womb, but you're willing to destroy it inside of the womb, it seems like you have a grave inconsistency. So again, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And what we find is this, that when we actually play it out even more, some of the people who lived the most difficult lives provided many of the greatest goods for humanity. Some of the people who have endured some of the greatest hardships in this world have overcome them, and they've been able to develop great character in light of them. And if they were to have been aborted, those things would have been foregone. So again, there are multiple things here, and summarizing it in this sense, the pro-life community has done a lot to provide for women. Adoption's a viable case. In no way, shape, or form does this argument change the definition of a human being. And finally, just because you live a hard life doesn't mean you should destroy that person's life. The next one, Emily. Emily's case is this. I'm pro Emily, who went through IVF, ending up with 6 viable implanted eggs requiring selective reduction in order to ensure the safety of her and a safe amount of fetuses. Which, do you know what the Latin for fetus is? Baby. Think about that. So there are kind of 2 issues here. The first is the safety of the mother. We've already dealt with it. The second is the safety of the other fetuses and or babies. So when we look at this, it's interesting. They're worried about the safety of the other children. I mean, just think of her argument here. 6 viable implanted eggs requiring selective reduction in order to ensure the safety of her and a safe amount of fetuses, because she sees that there's value. She doesn't want to hurt them. But when we look at this argument is actually in favor of the personhood of the preborn because it recognizes the value of at least some of the preborn children. Have you noticed this? It's not like it's trying to completely do away with all of them, only some of them. But why some of them? Why are some arbitrarily chosen in the womb and some arbitrarily just done away with in the womb? But as we look at this, it also wrongly supposes that some lives are more important than other lives. But we recognize in America that all persons have the right to life, even those who happen to be in the womb, even if there's multiple ones in the womb, that everybody has the right to life and liberty. And just because there are multiple other children within the womb doesn't somehow remove the inherent human value of the individual just because there's a lot of them and it might make for a hard pregnancy. In addition to it, this actually brings up another issue. This is actually a good argument against some of these IVF and all these other sort of fertility things that people do because, one, sometimes IVF and these other ones cause the conception of multiple children, some to life and others because we call them snowflake babies. Now think about this. Let me break this down here. If you're going to go and have some of these procedures, what they do is they take multiple eggs out of a woman and they take the sperm of the father and they fertilize the eggs and they sort through which ones they think are the healthiest and the ones that they think are going to be the most viable, and they choose one or however many that they decide at that point, and they implant it into the womb of the mother and it's supposed to grow. Well, what do they do with the other ones? They freeze them. They put them somewhere else, and they ensure you in many of these types of situations that they can go and they can retrieve those fertilized eggs and they can do the exact same thing, and you can have as many children as they can viably provide for you through that means. And that's why we look at this and we ask, is there any substantial difference between the child in the womb or in the petri dish or the ones that are frozen? No, And that's why we get this phrase called snowflake babies. Think about this. There are so many cases, and even people within Christian communities that fall for this, where they are totally against aborting a child. But if life begins at conception, then aren't all of the ones in the petri dish children? And aren't all the ones we froze or the snowflake babies children? Maybe this is something that we should just completely do away with. Just because we have the ability to do something doesn't make it morally right. And in these types of situations, we wouldn't be in them unless we were tinkering around with scientific advances that actually lead to moral harms. Notice this. The value of some fertilized eggs and or conceived are undermined through a similar selection process. Think about this. The only difference is that one is done in the womb and the other is done in a dish in the age of the preborn conceived children, or some are done by freezing them and they never come out. They're left there. Those souls, they're left there. Something to consider. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Consistency would demand that this be something we not pursue. The next one, Christina. This one says, I'm pro Christina, who doesn't want to be a mother, but birth control methods sometimes fail. Issue? Consent to sex does not mean consent to pregnancy. But there's also a couple of things. Unless a woman intends to become a mother, they should be allowed to abort her child. Or Christina does not intend to be a mother, as evidenced by her use of birth control. Therefore, Christina should be allowed to abort her child. And when we look at this, we find that the reason that it failed is because the birth control didn't work, whether it be the pill or some kind of condom that broke or some other means like that. But the underlying issue is that Christina doesn't actually intend to be a mother. So she shouldn't have to endure the child. But when we look at this whole consent to sex / pregnancy argument, there are many things that we have to see. First of all, since it is well known that pregnancy is a possible result of sex, then the mother is giving tacit consent to pregnancy when she has sex. If you know the effects of sex, you know the cause of pregnancy. If you know the cause of pregnancy and that one of the effects can be sex, you're tacitly agreeing to it each time that you participate. The only way to actually not get pregnant is to abstain, or the abstinence movement from sex. Second, the preborn child's right to life ought to take precedence over the mother's desire not to be pregnant, because personal desires against pregnancy do not undermine the personhood of the preborn child. Let's read that again. The preborn child's right to life takes precedence over the mother's desire not to be pregnant, because the personal desires against pregnancy do not undermine the personhood of the preborn. In addition to this, the real issue is the personhood of the child, not the desires of the mother. In short, desires are a red herring to the issue of the personal identity of the preborn child. We must focus on the main things, and we need to make the main things the main issue. And the main issue is the identity and the personal identity of the preborn child, not whether or not the mother actually wants to have the child. In many ways, we've always said this. The second she signed up to have sex, she signed up for the results of sex. And in this sense, her personal desires do not undermine the personhood of the preborn child. The next one, Jessica. It says this, I'm pro Jessica, who's finally getting the strength to get away from her physically abusive spouse only to find out she's carrying the monster's child. What's the issue? If a woman is in an abusive relationship and happens to be pregnant with her abuser's child, then she is permitted to abort the child. So let's look at this issue and we'll call it abusive relationship or abusive relationships. Notice this, abortion does not take away the evil of abusive relationships. It adds another evil to it. Have you noticed this? Same form of argument, just used in a variety of different ways. The real problem of abuse is not remedied by abortion. We don't fix evil by adding evil to it. We fix evil by bringing justice to the situation. But the person who is abusing the woman is one who should be punished, for that's the truly guilty one, not the innocent baby. Just like in all of the other cases, the rapist, the abusive individual here is the guilty party, not the innocent child. The abusive relationship does not somehow change the personhood of the preborn child, and a preborn child is a human person regardless of the mother's circumstances. those circumstances do not change the substantial identity of the child. Since the woman has already left the abusive relationships per the conditions of the story, notice we're trying to deal with the conditions, not some, well, hypothetical. No. Notice, both the mother and the child are free from the abusive husband and or boyfriend. But why would we remove the mother and child from one abusive relationship just to put the child in another abusive relationship? Namely, abortion is the ultimate form of abuse because it takes the life of an innocent human being. If you're willing to free the woman because she has inherent human value, why are you not willing to preserve the life of the child who's substantially and equally a human being and carries equal value? The point is this. The reason we protect Jessica from an abusive relationship is because she's an innocent human being that has the right to be protected. Similarly, we have the need to protect Jessica's preborn child because the child is an innocent human being that has the right to be protected. Logically, every good argument to protect Jessica in an abusive relationship is a good argument to protect her preborn child from an abusive abortion. Why? Because they both have the same substantial nature, they have the exact same rights afforded unto them, and they have the equal protection as human beings under the law. Vanessa says this, I'm pro Vanessa, who went into her confirmation appointment after years of trying to conceive, only to hear silence where there should be a heartbeat. Issue, if a child is stillborn, the mother should be allowed to abort. They're claiming this is a viable case for abortion. See, if we don't have abortion clinics in these types of situations, you're going to have these women like Vanessa who have been trying for years to have a child, trying to conceive, to only hear silence. And again, we're not trying to downplay these types of situations. We know that they're hurtful. We know that they're harmful to the emotional stability and the long haul of things that people have faced over the years. But let's look if it's actually a good argument for Roe v. Wade and federal abortion or state abortion or abortion as such. Let's continue to look at this. Notice this. The argument makes a fundamental category mistake. The pro-life position argues that we are to protect all innocent life and that to take an innocent life through abortion is murder. But notice this. However, in this situation, what takes place is technically not the taking of an innocent life and or murder because the child has already died. It's not in this situation where we're finding here, the stillborn child doesn't technically fall under the proper definition of an abortion. There's truly a difference of kind between an abortion and removing a stillborn child. Abortion, as we've seen, is the intentional killing of an innocent human being, whereas removing a stillborn child is not the intentional killing of an innocent human being. Why? Because the child has already passed away. There's a substantial difference. One is alive and one is not. This one is, in many respects, a type of medical procedure that may have many similarities to having a child in certain circumstances. They may have to induce a woman in certain types of circumstances like this, but the difference it makes is that one is actually taking of life and one is removing the body of a child that has already passed on. There's a substantial difference between the two. Let's look at the case of Lindsay. It says this, I'm pro Lindsay, who lost her virginity in her sophomore year with a broken condom and now has to choose whether to be a teenage mom or just a teenager. So in this sense, is she going to have to deal with being a mother at a young age? The issue, well, there's kind of two issues here. The first, this is another restatement of the Christina argument, a consent to sex. So we're not going to deal with it again. By her consenting to sex, she is actually, in many respects, opening up the door to a consent to pregnancy. Again, if you know the cause of pregnancy, when you actually perform the cause of pregnancy, you're actually, in many respects, tacitly agreeing to the effects of the cause of pregnancy. However, the second one is that Lindsay shouldn't be forced to be a mother at such a young age, given this hardship and this idea now she's going to be a teenage mom and all the social and practical and financial consequences it's going to bring. So we'll call this the age of the woman. First, since it is well known that pregnancy, like we said, is a possible result of sex, then the mother is giving tacit consent to pregnancy when she has sex. So she knows what's going on. Second, it does not follow that because Lindsay will have to be a mother at such a young age that her child should be forced to die at such a young age. Did you notice that? It does not follow that because Lindsay will have to be a mother at such a young age that her child should be forced to die at such a young age. Everyone recognizes that Lindsay will face hardships, but the greatest hardship in this situation would be Lindsay's preborn child being aborted. In addition to this, there are real means other than abortion available to Lindsay, and we've already discussed some of these. She could always adopt the child. There could be the supportive care of her whole family, not just Lindsay. There are charities and other organizations that pro-life advocates have provided for decades. In short, the real issue is the person of the child, the personhood of the child, not Lindsay's age. Lindsay's quality of life at a young age, or supposed lack thereof if she has a child, does not justify the taking of her preborn child's actual life. Also, the age of Lindsay and the quality of her life does not somehow substantially change the inherent nature of the child she's pregnant with. A child is a child regardless of the age of the mother. So the point is this: if you want a good argument for the personhood of the preborn, I'd ask you to please watch the video by Peter Kraft, and I'm going to leave that in the comments section below and the actual thing of the argument here. So what I want to do here in our final section is this. I want us to think about the reality of this, is that there are a lot of arguments and there are a lot of reasons that people have used over the years to justify abortion. And frankly, none of those arguments have worked. At least I've never found them rationally compelling or rationally valid or actually rationally sound in any respect of the term. But I want to close with this. There are real situations in life where we have to stand up for the unborn, or the preborn, we could almost say. And I remember hearing a case where an individual said that there was a woman that he knew who was pregnant, and she was going to go down and she was going to have an abortion. And he reasoned with her, and he supported her, and he worked with her in every sense of the term. And by God's grace, that woman did not go down and have an abortion. And I'm another instance, in another case, where I'm thankful that my uncle reasoned with my mother, who was on the way to the abortion clinic, where if she would have done that horrendous act, I wouldn't be here today. But the reality is that by God's grace and God's provision and providence, I am here today. So I want to conclude this video by saying this: all of us have broken the law of God. All of us fall short of the glory of God. All of us have sinned before the God of all creation. And the taking of innocent life is murder. And all murder is sin. And if this is something that you've done, I want you to know this: you do fall under the just condemnation of the law of God. But Jesus Christ came. He lived a perfect life. He lived a life underneath the law. He lived it perfectly. And Jesus Christ died for sinners. Think about it in this sense. If we were to stand in our own righteousness as lawbreakers, we are guilty and due punishment from a holy, just God. But Jesus Christ came and he lived the life that we should have lived, and he died the death that we should have died. Jesus Christ died on the cross for sinners like you. And while he was on the cross, he was bearing the wrath of God for the sins of humanity. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Are you a person who's believing in the Lord Jesus Christ? Is your conscience nagging you? Are you in dire need of the forgiveness of the eternal God of all creation? That can be found in the forgiveness in Jesus Christ. If this is you, I pray that you will please go read your Bible, reach out to an evangelical pastor, hear the gospel, repent of your sins, place your faith in Jesus Christ, where the forgiveness of sins is found.